All right. Hello, everyone. Give me a sec. We've got a new setup today. Yes, I'm late. I'm sorry. Got my tea here as well. I cooked dinner and it took a long time because I decided that I was going to make curry paste from scratch and that took a while, but the curry was nice, so. Whoa. Wow, so who have we got in the chat? We've got Josh, S317, we've got Patrick, Brian, Victorian Railway Heritage, Albert, Applehead, and Herman. Oh, and Steph. Hello, everyone. Oh, let's see if there's any useful comments yet. Yes, Josh has said Victoria relies on broad gauge for passenger mainly, so it's going nowhere fast. Yes. Okay, so start with channel updates. I will try to have a video ready for Sunday, but I'm quite busy with uni and such at the moment. So, yeah, we'll see. No promises. If it spirals out, then I'll postpone it to next Sunday. If I can put something quick together, then it'll come out Sunday. You'll find out tomorrow because I'll post on Instagram. And Josh sent me a message, as well as Albert, that I only got the one for Albert. Or at least that was the one I saw first. Anyway, I've got a bunch of notes written down for today. Firstly, I want to mention the thumbnail, which a lot of you will have seen by now. It is of T413 at the head of the Farewell Murrayville broad gauge trip at Murrayville. Of course, we talked about the trio of Farewell broad gauge trips last week, well, 2 weeks ago. And so, yeah, but T413 is relevant because it has been gauge converted from narrow gauge originally to broad gauge now. Originally it was numbered D1 and operated in Vinesford near Geelong. But yeah, and Murrayville, of course, has been converted to standard gauge now. So, firstly, for any non-railway enthusiasts which happen to be watching, or even any beginning enthusiasts, what is gauge? Well, in this context, it is the track gauge, which is the inner width between the two rails. And you've got a bunch of different gauges, depending on how wide or narrow the tracks are. Is 4 foot 8.5, 1435 millimeters, and anything wider than that is considered broad gauge, and anything narrower than that is considered narrow gauge. Having said that, in the context of Australia, if you hear someone refer to broad gauge, they are almost definitely referring to Victorian/Irish broad gauge, which is 5 foot 3 inch, 1,600 millimeters. So, break of gauge is when railways of two different gauges meet, and it's called the break of gauge because trains can't easily continue from one gauge to another. it's sort of possible with a few tricks and blah, 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 blah. We'll talk about that later. But as a general rule, you can't run a train straight from one gauge to another. And so that's why it's a big issue. Sorry, I've got my leaves and stuff in my mouth and the curry. Anyway, so yeah, it's obviously an issue, especially when you've got lots of different break of gauge points, because you've got to transship passengers and cargo, basically. How did it come about? Well, in the very beginnings of railways in the world, nobody really thought about having to connect two different railways. And so, there was a few sporadic railways and such built. And I guess you could almost say that tramways, like horse-drawn tramways, came before proper railways. And so, yeah, they were so separated that a lot of the designers back then just didn't think of it. However, by the time that Australia was starting to think about building its railways, England had had enough experience with railways to know that break of gauge was a real problem and to be avoided. Sorry about that. But for the country that was told to pick a gauge, doesn't matter which gauge, just pick one and stick with it, we ended up with 13 to 15 different gauges in Victoria alone and another 15 outside of Victoria within Australia. And I'm sure internationally there's even a few more. So I'll get to all of them in a minute. So we're going to talk about, we've briefly mentioned why it's so costly, and we're going to talk about potential solutions that different people have come up with over the years, workarounds, and timelines. We're going to talk about the timeline of gauges in Australia, and also my future predictions on what will happen going forward, what's best to happen, etc., etc. So before I get started, Victorian Rail Heritage said originally a T413 existed at one point, but it was renumbered into a H class, and Apple had said H1. That's right. So it's scrapped, says Victorian Rail Heritage? No, I don't believe so. H1. Oh, actually, H1 might be scratched. Hello, dog. Hang on a sec. Yes. So maybe H1 is scrapped. Whoops, I don't know which H's are and which H's aren't. But we still have a T413 that VR used at one point still here, yes. G'day, C504. You would think Melburnians' tramways would be broad gauge, but they're actually standard gauge. True, apart from the Victorian Railways tram networks, which there's only like two, they were broad gauge. So Victoria had break of gauge in trams as well. Except it wasn't really a big issue with trams because, everyone picked a gauge and stuck with it for the most part, apart from the VR. And their trams never really connected with the rest of the trams, so it didn't really matter with tramways, or at least not that type of tramway, the sort of electric street tram. But it did matter with sort of industrial tramways, but we'll get to that. I wonder why VR decided to have everything broad gauge. I'll get to that. Josh says he believes H5 was T413 and H3 and H5 are in heritage, says Applehead. Okay. Well, I'd have to look up which, and H1 isn't scrapped, says Josh. And g'day R711. Right, well, that's the people who are debating about H1 versus T1413, etc. Do your research, like go look up Wikipedia and then come back and tell everyone in this chat what the actual answer is. Oh, and Josh just checked. H1 is the real 413. There you go. So, yes, I'd like to copy-paste something into the chat, which is the list of different gauges in Victoria and Australia. Oh, there's too many. Maybe I can put it another way. Nope, it doesn't. Okay. I'll tell you what. I'll put the list of gauges in the description when we finish this video. But since I can't really put it into the chat because it's over the character limit, actually, yeah, I've got another idea. Right, there's part 1. There's part 2. And it's in a very weird format, but I will put it in the description as well once we finish. So, yeah, you can just sort of have a gaze through that and you can see the list of different gauges that I've come up with for Victoria and Australia. And, yeah, short answer is 13 to 15 different gauges in Victoria alone. And I give that range because there was gauge isn't necessarily very accurate with wooden railed tramways. And famously in the Rubicon Forest, there was an incident where there was a derailment basically because nobody knew what the actual correct gauge was. Somebody originally thought it was 3 foot 4 1/4, I believe. And then another person thought it was 3 foot 8, 3 foot 6. Another person thought it was 3 foot 4 1/2. And yeah. G'day, Lee. So, yeah, in terms of just touching on briefly on the benefits and disadvantages of various different gauges. In theory, the narrower the gauge, the tighter the line can curve, and therefore you can potentially save on earthworks and therefore construction costs. But yeah, and theoretically, the wider the gauge, the more stable it is. But in practice, the difference isn't huge. Yeah, and I'll get to why later. I actually think that maybe Australia would have been better off building entirely narrow gauge, but we'll get to that. So, the first bit of the timeline in terms of who like how the different gauges came about in railways, and how it all evolved in Australia. It all started even before any railways were constructed in Australia. And keep in mind that at this time there was communication with England, but the overland telegraph had not been built, so communication with England still had to be done via ship, which on the fastest clipper ships at the time, that journey would take about 3 months. So Australia was still quite isolated socially, I guess, although it definitely, I mean, it was still, we're talking 1850 odd here, so it was still very much an English colony, but yeah, it was a distant outpost sort of thing. And England wasn't too concerned about our well-being in regards to railways and stuff. But they did send us a message and said, basically, just pick one. So before construction of any railways, there was an agreement made between the colonies that everyone would adopt standard gauge. Just made sense. Then it all sort of started to unravel when the Sydney Railway Company hired an Irish engineer. And this Irish engineer persuaded New South Wales to officially adopt broad gauge, that's right, broad gauge, as their standard gauge. And so Victoria said, okay, fine, we'll match you. And South Australia said, okay, fine, we'll match you. And then the Irish engineer was sacked and was replaced with a Scottish engineer. And in Scotland, they use standard gauge, not broad gauge. So they're back to standard gauge. New South Wales said, we're building standard gauge from now on. And Victoria just said, okay, we just don't want constant switching around. Are you sure that's your choice? Do you want to switch back again? And South Australia just said, we'll follow whatever Victoria does. The Victorian government put out a notice to the different companies that were planning on building railways around Victoria, and they asked them about whether they preferred broad or standard gauge. Only one company specified a preference. I'm not sure which company that was, but they preferred broad gauge. And so Victoria said, okay, well, we'll stick with broad gauge. It's worth noting that the first railway company, the Melbourne and Hobsons Bay Railway, from Port Melbourne to Flinders Street, they had plans for both broad and standard gauge, but they had to put in an order for their locomotive from England, and even communication between colonies was a bit slow. So in the end, they just said, you know what, we're just going to go with broad gauge, because New South Wales hadn't even started on their railways yet, so it was still possible that they would change. And so they tried to get New South Wales to do a double backflip and switch back to broad gauge, but they were stubborn and built standard gauge anyway. And South Australia was thinking of converting to standard gauge to match New South Wales, but Victoria convinced them to no, just please stay with us. So they did. Concerns were raised immediately after the second railway was built that it was standard gauge, not broad gauge. So New South Wales was advised to do a gauge conversion of their line because it wasn't very big and it was just going to prevent a whole lot of issues. And if everyone, there was still time to solve the problem, It wasn't as easy as everyone had liked, but it could have not turned into the mess that it did. But they ignored. And basically stubbornness quickly got out of hand when Victoria refused to change and New South Wales refused to change. So they both just stuck with what they were doing. And that was that. So, looking at comments, Josh says P22 is owned by Regional Connect, allocated to SRHC, same with 23. All broad gauge, says Victoria Rail Heritage, rolling stock and locomotives would have to be completely overhauled, costing billions. Yes, re-gauged. Technically, says Josh, anything that happens in Australia can be overruled by Her Majesty the Queen. I don't think she'd overrule us deciding to have a uniform gauge. Is the engine from England still here? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Victorian Rail Heritage. Roderick Smith says VR used 1600mm for the St Kilda to Brighton tramway, but 1435 for the Sandringham to Black Rock and Beaumaris tramway. There you go. Even the VR couldn't decide on a gauge for their tramways. If Victorian Railway Heritage, if you're talking about the original locomotive that was first ordered from England, no, that was scrapped long ago. Which is a bit of a shame, but yeah, it was. Keep in mind that the preservation movement didn't really start until the 1950s or 60s even. And in fact, it was the scrapping of the S-class locomotives that really kick-started the preservation movement in Victoria and Australia for that matter. But before then, stuff was scrapped because it was just life expired and that's what you did. I'm sure it had a good life though. In spite of popular belief, the first break of gauge between Vic and New South Wales was in Wodonga, not Albury. Huh. There you go. I didn't know that. And I thought I would have come across that in researching this live stream, but anyway. So the second, let's just adjust that. That's better. The second big issue in regards to break of gauge came about in 1865 when Queensland decides to build its first railway, and it prefers narrow gauge because, keep in mind, Queensland at the time had a population of only a few thousand Europeans, so they weren't really too concerned with the future and what all the other states were doing. So, yeah, they just decided that they would build narrow gauge because it was going to be cheaper for them to construct. And in fact, they built the first narrow gauge main line in the world. So, fun fact. Not the most heroic achievement, I guess, but anyway. And the first, keep in mind, I should mention that throughout all of this, we're just talking railways at the moment, not talking tramways. They existed throughout all of this, but it wasn't until later in the timeline that the breaker gauge really started to become an issue for tramways. So in 1867, South Australia decides to build narrow gauge for a few new lines. Now you might say, hang on a minute, weren't they using broad gauge before? Yes, they were. But they just decided that narrow gauge was going to be better for certain railways because cheaper to construct because of the earthworks. And they never anticipated at the time that the narrow gauge and broad gauge systems were going to be connected. So they thought, it doesn't really matter. But of course, later, the narrow gauge networks they connected to both standard gauge and broad gauge, and it ended up South Australia had a few points of triple break of gauge, such as in Pilbara. And it's also worth noting, I guess, that there's a collection of railways still in South Australia on the Eyre Peninsula, spelt EYRE for those non-Australians, but that is still, part of it is still operating today as narrow gauge, 3'6", which is 762, I think. Better just double check that. 1067 millimetres. 762 is Victorian narrow gauge. So yeah, it is the Eyre Peninsula Railways, for the most part, still are operating independently, completely. If they're not connected to the other parts of the network. Having said that, narrow gauge is still one of the reasons why they are on the decline, really. Roderick says both Wodonga and Albury were break of gauge simultaneously when the bridge was built. Then that was simplified. Huh. Okay, there you go. Josh, the Eyre Peninsula Railway closed to grain traffic last year, yes, and that caused the closure of some of the lines, but there's still a couple of them that are open still for gypsum traffic, I believe. So, in 1879, Western Australia also decides to use narrow gauge for the same reasons that Queensland does, and also they think that they are really separate and wouldn't have a chance of being connected to the main network. So, yeah. Josh, it's less than half capacity on the Eyre Peninsula Railways. If you look up the Wikipedia article, that will explain everything. Yeah, it's really sad that we've sort of lost the Eyre Peninsula Railway. Having said that, just a quick side note, I do actually have a friend who lives in Coffs Harbour, that's right, which is on the Eyre Peninsula, and they say that all of the residents there are a little bit annoyed that the closure of the railway has led to, of course, more trucks on the roads. So I guess there's still a chance that they might be revived, but it's kind of unlikely if you ask me. So the next big milestone is Federation of Australia in 1901. Standard gauge was still only in New South Wales at the time, but it was finally decided as a bit of a consensus that standard gauge would at least be preferred for future railway builds. But that doesn't mean it was enforced or anything like that. In 1912, construction started on the Trans-Australian Railway, which was one of the biggest engineering projects of the time. And it ran from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie, and it was built as standard gauge. And this was it was constructed by South Australia, who had traditionally preferred either broad gauge or narrow gauge. And even the Commonwealth Railways, who was the organisation which was going to be running the Trans-Australia Railway, even they had built narrow gauge for their other railways, but decided standard gauge is the way to go. And honestly, that was the right choice. Although it definitely created a lot of breaker gauge headaches for a number of years, ultimately it was the first step towards having a standard gauge national rail network. But I said that it caused a bunch of breaker gauge headaches. If you wanted to ship something from, say, Brisbane to Perth, well, you would have to transship it no less than 4 times. How ridiculous is that? And if you're a passenger, you'd also have to change trains 4 times. At least. I think there might have been more than that at some point, but anyway. There was a Royal Commission that finished in 1921, which was into the breaker gauge problem in Australia because it was really starting to become apparent. And it recommended standard gauge conversion of a large amount of Australia. But it was rejected basically because it was going to be too costly. And during the 1920s, it was really started to become the height of tramways through 1920s through the 1930s. And tramways themselves were a whole different ball game with a mess of different gauges. I think between the Rubicon Forest and Alexandra, there were 4 different gauges. Broad gauge at Alexandra, 2 foot on the steel tramway to get to the base of the forest, and all of the SEC stuff up there was 2 foot. But the wooden rail tramways were 3 foot 4.5, 3 foot 4.25. I'm sort of counting that as one, and 3 foot 6 for another of the tramways. It's also worth noting that tramways had wide flanges, wooden rail tramways. All the vehicles tended to have very wide flanges, and that was to accommodate the variation in gauge. In true gauge, I should say. They always planned to have it roughly the same, but the variation was quite high. In 1930, standard gauge. Before that, in 1922, Wikipedia notes that there was 273 inventions that proposed to solve breaker gauge. but none were adopted. And a third rail dual gauge was being considered in Australia for some of its tracks, but it was kind of considered a bit reckless at the time. So, but you'll later find out that it was adopted. So 1930, standard gauge finally reaches South Brisbane, and Brisbane becomes the first capital to be connected. Brisbane and Sydney become the first two capital cities in Australia to be connected with one single gauge. That's an achievement for Australia. 1937, standard gauge reaches Port Pirie, and Port Pirie becomes a triple break of gauge point. This is over in South Australia. So the Trans-Australia Railway no longer starts at Port Augusta. It now starts at Port Pirie, which stayed that way for a number of years. Then World War II really starts to kick into gear, and with the huge numbers of troops and cargo being transported everywhere, it really shows Australia what a pain in the arse break of gauge is. And so at the end of the war, Harold Clapp, former Commissioner of the Victorian Railways, was commissioned to do a report in 1945 on the break of gauge problem in Australia. So the Clapp report recommended the following: gauge conversion, gauge standardisation, I should say, from Fremantle and Perth to Kalgoorlie. Recommended all of South Australia and Vic broad gauge to be converted to standard gauge. All of South Australian, Southeast and Peterborough region narrow gauge be converted to standard gauge. Recommended the Silverton Tramway in New South Wales, which was about the only narrow gauge line in New South Wales, to be converted. And I should say it was the only narrow gauge line, and it was never converted. It was closed, but they wanted it converted. Harold Clapp did. And recommended a new standard gauge line from Burke in New South Wales to Townsville in Queensland and Mount Isa and Darwin via Cunnamulla, Charleville, Blackall, Longreach and Winton, including gauge conversion of some of those lines. But again, it was really only, it was just too expensive to do. And the Clapp report mentioned that he said if only main trunk lines were converted, it would make the breaker gauge more common and would be more costly in itself over time than just doing everything the report says. Roderick says USA had multiple gauges. There was a big project, 1880s ? To unify them, and that happened almost overnight. 915 remained as a secondary gauge with a network in Colorado. Interesting. Victorian Railway Heritage says B60 was named after him, so it's good that A60 was recently preserved, referring to Harold Clapp. Yes. Adelaide and Melbourne had a common gauge from 1887. Brisbane to Sydney was the second such link. Very true. I didn't consider that. So Adelaide and Melbourne, although connected by standard gauge now, was broad gauge for many, many years. But in terms of links that exist mainly today. The South Brisbane link was really a defining one still. And the Harold Clapp report recommended modernisation of routes as well, so straightening of curves and easing of grades, because they said modernisation was very important as well. Victoria was mainly okay with the report. They thought it was going to be a bit costly, but they could understand what it would do. And South Australia didn't like the report because the Darwin link wouldn't run through their state, so they weren't ready to adopt it. And Queensland and Western Australia saw no advantage, as they already had almost entirely one gauge and therefore only one break of gauge point. And yeah, then it was just like it was going to be too costly for them as well. They didn't want to pay for it. Gauge conversion did continue though, but it was very sporadic after that. And in 1956, the Wentworth Committee found that a large-scale conversion of lines was indeed uneconomical, but trunk conversion was long overdue. So, Albury to Melbourne was priority 1 in the report, and that was completed first in 1962. Broken Hill to Adelaide via Port Pirie was also priority 2, and that was built third. And Kalgoorlie to Perth and Fremantle was priority 3, but built second. Roderick Smith said, one problem with the Clapp scheme is that it was still steam era. Conversion of the locomotives was an issue. Into the diesel era, conversion wouldn't have been an issue. Yeah, that's also worth noting as well. Steam engines, even the gauge convertible ones, are a lot more difficult to convert than and the Victorian railways than diesels. The Victorian railways, in their later years of building steam engines, did build a number of engine classes to be theoretically gauge convertible, but that never happened in service. And the only such conversion that has happened is R766, which is currently in New South Wales on standard gauge. And the people who converted that found that it was a much more difficult task than first anticipated. Compare that to in Victoria now with the N-class diesels, which regularly get converted to and from standard gauge and broad gauge. So from 1966 onwards, the Pilbara region in Western Australia opened to mining, and it was that network remains today independent from the rest of Australia. However, it was built from the start to be standard gauge. And in fact, you'll note today that the Pilbara railways deal with a different kind of gauge that limits the rest of Australia, which is loading gauge. The Pilbara railways operate to the highest American standards, so they can pretty much import American locomotives, the biggest American locomotives, without too many modifications. But those same locomotives are too big and too heavy for the national network. So funny that. And the next big milestone was 1970, when the Indian Pacific first ran, which is, of course, the train which runs from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, Sydney to Perth via Adelaide. And yeah, it was the first truly transcontinental passenger train to be one uniform gauge in Australia. And J512 is now on standard gauge, says Victorian Rail Heritage. Steam engines have so many more sets of wheels, so it's understandable. It's not just the wheels. It's all the gearing and everything. And Roderick Smith says, chicken and egg break of gauge for interstate traffic wasn't an issue when Australia wasn't industrial. The main traffic was hinterland to port. Interstate shipping sufficed. Yeah, that's a good point. It wasn't really until World War II that, as I said, that Australia industrialised, and the break of gauge between states really became a huge issue. Passengers had to deal with it a bit as well, but yeah. Herman says there's all sorts of space that need and whatnot that need changing for steam engines. Yes. The Finesford line, says Victorian Rail Heritage, was narrow gauge and converted to broad gauge when VR had bought the line. Not quite true. The Finesford Railway always was narrow gauge, and it remained narrow gauge until its closure, T413, which was purchased after the closure of the Finesford Railway was converted to broad gauge. The Victorian Railways built a broad gauge branch line to meet with the Finesford Railway, but even then they were still a little bit separate. The Finesford line was never gauge converted, put it that way. The B class, says Brian, were built in Sydney and driven to Bandiana in the east of Wodonga, where they were converted to broad gauge. Yep. G'day, Marcus. 1983. So when the Indian Pacific first started operating, I should have said that it actually didn't go to Adelaide. It went right through Port Pirie and stuff. But before that, I should say, in 1974, standard gauge reaches Alice Springs via a new line branching off from Tarcoola in South Australia. And that was when the old quirky GAN stopped running, and the new GAN, almost as we know it today, began running. So what was the Central Australia Railway wasn't so much gauge converted as it was built to a whole new route. There were parts of it which were shared, but for the most part, it was a new route. Roderick Smith says South Australian Railways did convert some 1067 gauge T-class locos to 1600, then converted them back again. The SAR 400 class Garretts were designed for 3 gauges, but that didn't happen. There you go. So it's worth noting with the Alice Springs standard gauge line that the North Australian Railway, which was Darwin to Burdum, was still operating, and that was narrow gauge. Standard gauge, or even it was always planned for the North and Central Australian Railways to meet, but it didn't happen for a long time. But yeah, in 1976, the traffic ceased running on the North Australian Railways, so it wasn't really a big consideration after that. 1983, standard gauge reaches Adelaide from Crystal Brook. 1995, Melbourne to Adelaide converted from a through broad gauge line to a standard gauge line, along with a few other random branch lines along the way in both South Australia and Victoria, to prevent them becoming isolated. And the remaining railways in South Australia that were that they didn't want to convert were going to be cut off by the standard gauge, so they decided just to close them at broad and narrow gauge lines. Notably, Mount Gambier closed at that time, which was probably the most controversial. Yes. And so, yeah, sporadic gauge conversion happened from then onwards, but it wasn't until 2004 when finally Darwin was connected to Alice Springs via standard gauge and became the final mainland capital of Australia to be linked by railways, by a standard gauge. It's worth noting, just as a little postscript to all of that, that Tasmania is narrow gauge. They had a lot of tramways as well, but even so, breakaway gauge wasn't such a huge issue for them. Whyalla did not get a mention, Roderick. Western Australia also converted Esperance and Leonara to match. Yes, although they're not part of the national scheme as such. Yeah, so there's a few other gauge conversions of lines that happened over the years and such, but yeah, I've just sort of mentioned the main ones. Whyalla, I believe, is still narrow gauge. I could be wrong. But Whyalla still receives rail traffic, that's for sure. So, should Australia have adopted 3'6" as the standard Australian gauge? Yes and no. Firstly, historically, if you add up all the track kilometres of standard gauge today versus 3'6" historically, 3'6" wins out. Especially before major standard gauge conversions really happened, there was more 3'6" in Australia than there was standard gauge. So should we have just gone 3'6"? It's a tough one. 346 certainly doesn't seem to limit Queensland too much, and Western Australia as well. But Queensland is the biggest user of 346 these days, I'd say. And yeah, you can certainly run fast, reasonably fast trains on narrow gauge. Queensland runs up to 160 kilometres an hour in regular service, and their tilt train set a speed record at like 230 or something like that. And that was a worldwide narrow gauge speed record, but only for the record. I believe Japan operate regularly trains up to 200 kilometres an hour on 346 narrow gauge. However, the exact stability limits of narrow gauge, especially 346, I don't think anyone really knows what the upper limit is. But Japan, when they decided to build bullet trains, decided to go standard gauge, and they were, I believe, mostly a 346 country before that. So it was an interesting decision, but it probably worked out for the better for them. Certainly, I think now Australia shouldn't turn back on the standard gauge conversions, but perhaps 346 could have been a national standard. Roderick Smith says Whyalla was a new track built to match the Wentworth routes and was the first addition to the base scheme. The iron ore railways at Whyalla were and are 1067. There you go. Thought that on narrow gauge. Okay. Oops. So I guess my future predictions for gauges in Australia, I definitely predict that we're not going to have a huge push, at least not until the very end. I see us doing way more sporadic conversions. Western Australia possibly might decide at some point to do a relatively large scale conversion of their lines. But if any state was going to do it, I'd say WA would be the one to do it. But yeah, it's still unlikely. Queensland, I think, is definitely going to hold off until the very, very last possible time, because they've only got one breaker gauge point still, which is Brisbane. Everything else is 346, and it works fine. They don't have a real need to do large-scale conversions. And it also helps with Queensland that a lot of their traffic, if it's interstate traffic, there's not too much that, because Brisbane, there's not too much that needs to come from the rest of Queensland down to Brisbane, change gauges, and go to elsewhere in Australia. There is some, but there's not that much compared to the rest of the freight, which tends to go to other ports or just the port of Brisbane itself. So, yeah, just the whole geographical and railway layout of Queensland is different to the other states. so the breaker gauge doesn't make a bit of a difference to them. And it would be very costly for Queensland to do gauge conversion, so hence I think they will hold off until very last. Roderick Smith says South Africa runs 1067, both heavy and fairly fast. Seychelles, Sandala, iron ore regularly rivals Pilbara for heavy haulage. There you go. So it's not so much that the gauge limits your capacity and such, but it's just the quality of track which ultimately limits it, and the loading gauge. So Victoria is the next likely state which I think possibly might do mass gauge conversion, because about 50%, I think it's a little bit less than 50% of our track is standard gauge. If the Sea Lake and Manangatang lines get converted, then I think that will tip the scales to be over 50% standard gauge in Victoria. Having said that, as Josh mentioned at the start of the stream, it's really passenger trains heavily rely on broad gauge, so it wouldn't be too difficult to convert the V-line carriages and stuff. And even the metro stuff, it's not that it would be difficult, but with V-line, you can it wouldn't be too hard to do it in pieces, because their fleet is already in 2 gauges, so it wouldn't be nothing really new for V-line. But for metro, it would be difficult. You'd essentially be splitting the system again, and don't split it if you don't have to. So if you're going to do gauge conversion, do it all at once. It's costly, but it's cheaper in the long run. I don't see many other new lines being built to anything but standard gauge. The only real recent exception to a new line that was built as not standard gauge is the regional rail link from Deer Park to Werribee. And that was broad gauge, and I think that was the right call to make it broad gauge. However, here's what Victoria should be doing a lot more of that it's not, and that is gauge convertible sleepers. Wooden sleepers, easy enough to gauge convert. You just drill a couple new holes, done. Concrete sleepers, you need to replace the whole sleeper if it's not a gauge convertible sleeper. So we've been putting in a lot of broad gauge only concrete sleepers, and that is just silly. We should definitely be doing it as gauge convertible sleepers. I think that it could pay Victoria in the long run for some legislation to be introduced to force any new sleeper replacement programs to use gauge convertible sleepers. Slightly more costly, but not even that much more costly in the short term, but cheaper in the long term, for sure. Victorian Rail Heritage says that's the only problem with converting between Ballarat and Geelong is that Steam Rail has a Ballarat depot and they still run trains between there. Yes, but that certainly isn't going to stop a government project. The Ballarat East depot of Steam Rail is lightly used, to put it like that. Yeah. Warwick Smith says Transport Minister Batchelor, aka Botchelor, flatly refused to install gauge convertible sleepers on the regional fast rail routes despite strong advocacy by professional engineers. Yeah, that's the thing, is that anyone who is directly involved with these sort of projects says definitely go gauge convertible sleepers, but then the politicians go, what's cheaper? And the engineers are forced to say, broad gauge sleepers. But it's cheaper in the long run to do gauge convertible. No. What's cheaper in the short term? What's cheaper in my term? 4 years. Yes. Politicians, hey? A lot of them don't know what is best, even when told what is the best by people who know what is the best. Anyway. So some solutions that have and workarounds that have been done for the break gauge problem. Well, the main one is dual gauge track, and that is more often than not a third rail type of dual gauge track. You can, however, have gauntlet dual gauge. I'll get to that in a sec. Third rail, the big limitation with that is that there's a speed limit of 80 kilometres an hour. Some would argue that that is a bit of a false like it's not, the speed limit shouldn't exist. But yeah, it's there. And it's only for broad gauge, I should mention, because if you think about it, let me see what I can do. Yeah. Okay, so on this envelope, you can see I've drawn 3 tracks. The outermost 2 are broad gauge, and the innermost 2 are standard gauge. If you've got broad gauge, then the one side of your train's wheels has to go in between the gap, and there's fears that the wheel could get caught in there because the gap is rather small. And yeah, is that justified? Is that not justified? I can't really say. I'm stupid says, don't mind my name. Are you okay, Floyd? You don't look all right. Yeah, I'm all right. The lighting might make me look a bit pale, but no, I'm all right. It's just the dealing with this webcam and the light that makes me look pale. Victorian Rail says, Victorian Rail Heritage, if everything in Victoria went standard gauge, then Heritage Rail would no longer operate on main lines. Yes and no. Heritage groups in Victoria really need to get their stuff together and start running on standard gauge because, hello, 50% roughly of our track is standard gauge. They all know that they're going to have to do it at some point, but for various reasons, nobody is actually really there yet. Steam rail is the closest. They've got a depot theoretically in Dimboola, which is standard gauge, and a few carriages on standard gauge, but they don't really have any locos on standard gauge, and they haven't run any standard gauge tours for like 4 years at least, something like that. Roderick Smith says, for a long time, broad gauge and standard gauge diesels have frames spaced for broad gauge and traction motors designed for standard gauge. Conversion is simple. The other size of traction motor is designed for 1067. Standard gauge EL's got them. Yeah, interesting. And in fact, I was reading about the General Electric, I think they're called ES44 ACI or DCI. They're the big American General Electric locomotive. A version of that was made for Brazil, I believe, that had to have smaller traction motors for the narrow gauge, and thus had to have more of them to rival the total output of the bigger ones. So I forget what you call that sort of configuration of wheels, but there's sort of 2 pairs of bogies at the front and 2 pairs of bogies at the rear. Yes, very true, says Herman. Seymour run standard gauge. They've just recently started up standard gauge, and yeah, you're right. So I switched my answers. Seymour is closest to having proper operations on standard gauge. Even then, they're still limited to basically one set of carriages. 707 says Victoria Heritage is committed to standard gauge. They recently bought T387 from CFCLA. It's going to be staying on standard gauge, not broad gauge. Yes, as I said, all the groups know it and they're all planning towards it, but it'll take a bit of time for them to get there. To have proper operations on standard gauge. And a lot of Seymour's standard gauge operations are cruise express stuff, so like all for that. If they need to, like, the charters are what really brings in the money. So definitely nothing against heritage groups doing charters, but from an pure enthusiast perspective, I'd like to see some more enthusiast-orientated tours on standard gauge. I'm sure it will happen at some point. There were Dodo locos built for Brazil, 2 8-wheel bogies. As far as I know, 762mm gauge. Yeah, I think it was just, I think you called the specific configuration that I was referring to is just DD. Although I think that's wrong. I think DD is something else. Is 2 prime movers in the one on 8-wheel bogies. But the ones in Brazil were definitely 4 sets of 4-wheel bogies. The channel says the only classes I think we won't see in standard gauge are the A2, Y, and K because they're of an older design. yes, I don't think they will be converted. Broad gauge is still sticking around for a while, I definitely think, but yeah. Albert says the Trans-Australian line used to run standard gauge trains made of wagons carrying narrow gauge tracks on them, designed to carry narrow gauge trains on top of the standard gauge train, making an interesting solution to break the gauge. Absolutely. Victoria had a bit of that sort of thing as well. Victoria Rail Heritage says S303 was going to go on standard gauge on a tour to New South Wales, but it's being postponed due to the virus. Okay, interesting. It was going to be a Cruise Express charter with C501. Okay. Roderick Smith says Ari Dernpav, that GE cast bogie from the 1930s, was designed for conversion, and some under Y-class diesels were done. Yeah. Yeah. So, where was I? Here we go. And 4-track triple gauge, which is sort of very similar to gauntlet track. Now, I'll draw you another little diagram, which we can pretend is both gauntlet and triple gauge. But, so, in triple gauge, you'd have the innermost tracks be narrow gauge, then those two be standard gauge, and those two be broad gauge. In gauntlet dual gauge, you'd have, say, those two broad gauge, those two standard gauge. And so, yeah, they're both two different designs, or like they're both the same sort of design, but the widths are slightly different, so that it's optimized for either triple gauge or gauntlet dual gauge. Most notably, gauntlet dual gauge was on the Upfield Somerton link in Victoria. Victorian Rail Heritage says, so why is everyone talking about standard gauge in Victoria now if we've had broad gauge for over 100 years now? Because Victoria has decided that standard gauge is the future. Australia has decided standard gauge is the future. And so, as I said already, over 50% of our track is standard gauge. That is up from 0% originally, until the 1960s, really, 0% standard gauge. So since the 1960s, we've been slowly converting line after line after line. And yeah. So a common solution to the breaker gauge problem this works especially well with diesels and any sort of passenger carriages and freight wagons is a bogie exchange. What is that? Well, it's when you've got one set of bogies built for broad gauge and one set of bogies built for standard gauge, and you lift up the carriage or whatever, you roll out the broad gauge ones, you roll in the standard gauge ones, or vice versa. You put it down. Sounds simple. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but relatively, it is actually one of the simplest solutions, and it works all of the time. And I believe in some international places, they even do that mid-journey. Possibly on the, what do you call it, Trans-Siberian Railway, I think that there's a bogie exchange that happens there. Somewhere else in Europe, there is a sort of station. They've got gauge convertible bogies that the train can run through a gauge conversion station type thing, so the passengers don't even need to get off, and the bogie, the wheels get compressed, and the train can continue on a different gauge. So there's that. Albury was famously a big bogie exchange point in Australia. Not so much anymore because it's through standard gauge now. Roderick Smith says Turbo is common, NZRs and DJ locos. New South Wales had one electric. North Korea had 4 rail gauntlet dual gauge, 1520 and 1435. Can't be done as 3 rail. Interesting. There you go. 2 close together. Albert says the Great South Pacific Express used to have bogie exchange mid-journey. There you go. Victoria Rail Heritage says changing B65 from standard gauge didn't work for it. When it went on broad gauge, it broke down and it hasn't operated since. And SSR were not bothered to fix the problem, so it was used for parts. Yeah, well, that I don't think would have been to do with the gauge conversion itself. There would have been other issues that contributed to that. The bogie exchange was in Wodonga East, says Brian. Okay, I thought there was just a normal freight exchange in Albury then, just like a platform manual transshipment. Yeah, with the rise of containerization today as well, containers are standard size, so it's not too difficult to just lift a container up, have a standard gauge train parked beside a broad gauge train, for example, and just lift the containers over. But yeah, it's not so much done with containers because most of that traffic doesn't need to be converted. But the steel train, which I guess you could say runs from it's Hastings in Victoria, and then it runs to Dynon, switches gauges, and goes up to Port Kembla, that's right. Collects the steel, comes back to Hastings for export. And the steel is transshipped both in containerized form and in real form, roll form, I should say. So, yeah, transshipment still occurs. Victorian Rail Heritage said they said it was an electrical problem in regards to B65. One thing that would be interesting to see that we haven't since the 1960s is loaded freight trains hauled by steam trains. I think you'll find that actually we haven't seen that since the 1990s, or maybe a little bit earlier, 1980s. Still, V-Line actually, when V-Line still had a freight division, and they were doing driver training of heritage drivers, they drove a few freight trains occasionally. Roderick Smith says Queensland Railways built a fleet of QLX wagons for bogie exchange to standard gauge the fruit/veg to the southern states. There was nothing to reciprocate, so it didn't happen. That is now an important container traffic. Yeah, there you go. Containerization has really changed the world. So, a little note about tramways. As I sort of mentioned before, gauge was even more of a mess for tramways than it was for railways, but 2-foot gauge is sort of what has been decided with tramways as the standard. A lot of off-the-shelf equipment with tramways, both historically and currently, is built to 2-foot. Queensland famously runs a lot of cane tramways, sugar cane tramways that cross over the Queensland main railway network, and all the cane lines are pretty much exclusively 2-foot gauge. For isolated tramways, you might think that, oh, well, gauge doesn't really matter to them at all because they were isolated and, who really cares? However, even historically, they need to order equipment. Tramways weren't really ones to build stuff themselves, like in the same way that the railways were. So off-the-shelf equipment was more vital for them, and therefore it was a lot easier for them to just order 2-foot a lot of the time. Having said that, it certainly didn't stop them from picking a whole bunch of different gauges. For the construction of the Hume Weir, I believe, and there's been a couple of major infrastructure projects that were intercepted with tramways from both Victoria and New South Wales, and even then the tramways were different gauges. Not only with a different gauge to the main railways, but they were a different gauge to themselves, so it blows your mind why people can't just pick a gauge and stick with it, but we've mentioned sugarcane tramways. We've mentioned earlier about Rubicon Alexandra. We've mentioned that gauge is sort of debatable on wooden rails. And quite honestly, there was a lot of derailments which happened in tramways because the tracks were just of so poor quality that the true gauge went like this a lot. And sometimes we would go a little bit too wide and the stuff would just fall in the middle. So, yes, says Brian, there was a tramway built for the construction of the Hume Weir. Yeah, I'm just not sure whether I was specifically which project I was specifically referring to in regards to the tramways from 2 different states that were of different gauges. Herman's channel said it might have been in the 90s or early 2000s. There was a one-off steam freight in New South Wales so that a shuttle was able to run somewhere for a weekend event. The cars were in the way, so they needed to be moved. Okay. Victorian Rail Heritage says it's strange that Southern Short-Haul Railroad still use S classes and Bs in regular freight service, as most other logistics companies do not use them, other than Cube, when they are hired by them for freight services. Yeah, look, Erwin suggests that it might be because there's little to no new broad gauge locos. With diesels, as has been mentioned before, it's not too difficult to build them to different gauges, as long as they fit within the loading gauge, which is the width and height and such, and as long as they're not too heavy, which is the axle weight, or both axle weight and total weight. They both matter to different degrees. As long as it fits within those parameters, which there's still a lot of new diesels which do, it wouldn't be too hard to build them to broad gauge. The reason that they don't, I suspect, because it's cheaper for them to revive old broad gauge locomotives and run them than buy totally new ones. Not necessarily because the new ones aren't available or it's expensive to build them in broad gauge. That's not what I'm saying. It's just expensive in general to buy new locomotives. I'm sure they've considered it. I mean, SSR have a number of locos that are essentially brand new that run on standard gauge, so they're certainly no strangers to new locomotives. But it might just be for the routes, the economics, they've worked out. You say there hasn't been any broad gauge loco since the G and the N in the 1980s. It depends if you want to count the VL class. They run on broad gauge regularly, and they're relatively new. Herman's, but as I explained, just because gauge doesn't really matter too much with diesels. It's not as big of a concern as it is with steam engines. Herman's channel says also most of SSR's older locos are EMD, and EMD two-strokes are almost bulletproof. Yeah, they're very reliable engines. But there's more to locomotives and any sort of thing like that than just the engine. So, yeah. But I'm sure they're a company. I'm sure they've run the numbers and they've determined that that is what works best for them. So, on the note of steam engines, because they've got traditionally a lot of fixed wheels, not so much in bogies, then it was common for curves, the exact gauge of curves, to be widened a little bit in order to accommodate for the longer steam locomotives. And actually, I believe in a few places in New Zealand, maybe, the opposite has happened. The curves have been narrowed just slightly in the diesel era. Yeah, a few places in South Australia, including Peterborough, which was the last and still is the last such place. It had a triple gauge turntable. All right, see, Albert. The triple gauge turntable is an interesting one because you have to balance the locomotive, right? So you can't just build 4-track gauntlet. So triple gauge turntables had 6 rails: narrow gauge, standard gauge, broad gauge. So that they would all be centered. You can look up photos of the Peterborough triple gauge turntable. It's quite well documented. The tracks can get very closely spaced together. And you didn't see that really done outside of a turntable because A, you don't need them all to be centered. B, the gap is really close between the 2 rails. So any sort of curves you might start to have issues. And C, 4-track gauntlet triple gauge works just fine. And it's cheaper to build 4 tracks to have 4 rails than it is to have 6 rails. That's why triple rail, 3-rail dual gauge is generally preferred over 4-track gauntlet dual gauge, because fewer rails equals fewer dollars. Victorian Railways narrow gauge. Yeah, I don't think there was a state that. I guess New South Wales did a pretty good job, and Queensland did. They both did the best job, I think, at sticking to their guns in regards to what gauge they picked. Victoria was almost 3rd place, but Victoria decided to build a few 2-foot 6-inch narrow gauge lines. The Victorian Railways Commissioners at the time actually wanted them to be built as broad gauge because they could see the issues in regards to narrow gauge, but again, cost. Parliament didn't want to build them as broad gauge. They wanted to build them as narrow gauge, and so they were, I believe, originally going to be built to 2 foot, but they were later, the VA commissioners convinced them to go a little bit wider to 2'6", and they were building all their own equipment anyway, so that factor didn't really matter to them. But yeah, I don't think there was anywhere else really, apart from what Victoria did. 2'6" wasn't a very common gauge in Australia, put it that way. Roderick Smith says another solution in Europe is rollboke, something like that. A 4-wheel standard gauge wagon goes onto a low height narrow gauge wagon, and standard gauge bogie wagon goes onto 2 sets of small wheel narrow gauge dolly wagons. Interesting. John Rail Heritage says B74 has been preserved since the 90s and still going strong to this day. Yep. Roderick says Gladstone had triple. Yes, Gladstone was another place which had triple, but Gladstone does not have triple anymore. Seymour's dual shows the same design. The standard gauge rails were machined to give clearance with the 1600mm rails. There you go. Victorian Rail Heritage says S310 is preserved at the Seymour Rail Heritage Centre, but hasn't run under its own power since 2004 and still features the V-Line orange and grey livery in the 1980s. Now, wouldn't it be nice if Seymour decided to reactivate that and put it in orange and grey? Like that's going to happen. I believe that Victoria has 3 currently operating commercial gauges. We've got a couple of different other gauges in tourist form, namely 2 foot and 2'6". But in terms of commercial operations, we've currently got 3. Of course, broad gauge and standard gauge for the main railways. And we've got an isolated tramway in Bogong Creek, which is still operating on the 3 foot gauge. So there you go. And yeah, just as a final little thing, Puffing Billy in the early days transshipped between narrow gauge and broad gauge quite often. Like the actual rolling stock was transshipped because it had to be taken to Newport to do heavy maintenance and such. And it was built there in the first place. So there was a few wagons from the Victorian Railways that were built to do that. And you can still see in Belgrave today, as I noted in my Puffing Billy video recently, where the narrow gauge track comes up to meet the broad gauge track. But in the commercially operating days of Puffing Billy, that switchover point was in Upper Ferntree Gully, not Belgrave. Belgrave was only used as a transshipment point in the Heritage era. Victorian Rail Heritage says, I prefer the VR livery over the V-Line orange and grey, but I still do like the V-Line orange and grey. Yeah, I probably prefer the blue and gold as well if I had to make a decision, but I'd like to see variety. That's what I'd really like to see. Roderick says, India has another nation with 4 gauges and lots of triple gauge stations. It has undergone a major unigauge project. 762 was common in India. There is some in Japan. There you go. We had a few weird gauges in Victoria, like it's either German or Swedish. I can't remember the origin, but 900mm was on the SEC electric tramway. And I guess it's worth just mentioning, what's the difference between a tramway and a railway? That's a simple question with a not so simple answer. It's a bit like asking the difference between red and yellow. You can say one is, red is such wavelength, yellow is such wavelength, but at what point does red become yellow and yellow become red? What about orange? That's a bit unclear. It's a scale. And generally, I just refer to it's a railway if it was built by the state and generally to a higher standard. It's a tramway if it was built by a commercial company and to a lower standard. However, there is definitely crossover, and I will even, call the cane stuff in Queensland railways because, quite honestly, it's built to a high standard, a lot of it. and the old GAN could almost be classified as a tramway because it was built to quite a low standard. Central Australia line, that is. But yeah. Yeah, we just had a lot of weird gauges. The widest in Australia we had was 9 foot in the Northern Territory. I'm not sure exactly where that was, but yeah. 6 foot was in Tasmania. But yeah, in some parts of Tasmania, that is. The smallest we really had was 1 foot 3 inch in Tasmania and New South Wales. Again, I'm not exactly sure where these things existed, but I have it on good word that they did exist. If you really want more information, join the Light Railways Research Society and ask them, because they know. That's where I got my information from. Roderick says, in the UK, the difference between tramway and railway was the legislation under which it was authorised. As far as I know, that it was Silverton was a tramway. Yeah, legislation definitely had a lot to do with it here in Australia as well, but yeah, as a general definition, it's hard to give precise cut-offs for what counts as a tramway and what counts as a railway, as I'm sure you know. Yeah, well, that's about all that I had in my notes. I knew this would be a long discussion, and sure enough, here we are almost at an hour 50 minutes. This could be my longest live stream yet. I'm not exactly sure. But I'll give everyone another minute or so to put in any last comments. Otherwise, I will wrap it up. 15-inch gauge was common as an amusement park gauge. Yes, it was. I wasn't counting any recreational railways in my list, and so that included amusement railways, garden railways, yeah, miniature railways, etc. Because honestly, if you didn't, you got to have a cut-off somewhere. If you didn't, you could almost say that, you know, N scale and HO gauge and such count towards the gauge problem in Australia, but that would be unfair. Anyway, I think that just about wraps it up. Oh, actually, Toronto Heritage says, if Cube ran low on locos one day, do you think steam locos would be used again for freight? Only if they were extremely desperate. They'd probably put it on trucks before they brought out the steam engines, put it that way. Because if they hire a B class or something from the heritage operators, they can still use their own drivers and such. Whereas if they hired a steam engine, you need to hire V-line crew, heritage crew, and there's only a small number of them, and they're expensive. As I said, only if they were extremely desperate. And the RHDR is 15-inch. I'm not sure what you mean RHDR, but anyway. Rod says, thanks, Floyd. For the first time, I've abandoned my evening work and watched your episode throughout. Well, thank you for that. And I noticed you have broken your code of silence this episode as well. But I'm sure everyone enjoyed Roderick's contributions. Anyway, we are at an hour 50, just over now. 10 likes, 10 viewers still. And K153 is being restored. Yes. That is exciting news. I'm glad that SteamRail decided to do that because, okay, there you go. That's what Ian is referring to as RHDR. Yeah, K183, just before we end, was involved in an accident a bit over 10 years ago. And it was even more than that. It was more like 16 years ago, more. And has been out of action ever since. The previous SteamRail board said that they didn't want to restore it out of respect for the people who lost their lives in that accident. But there's been a change of board since then. So the new board has obviously decided to restore it. And yeah. Anyway, that's a real discussion for another time. Thanks everyone for watching. And so, yeah, I'll try and have a video out for this Sunday. If not, if you don't hear anything, then it'll come out next Sunday. And I'll do another stream in 2 weeks' time. And for once, I might actually announce the topic now, because I did write it down. Okay, I haven't decided yet, but it's either going to be the myth of electrification or double deck versus single deck. Don't know which one yet, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. That'll be in 2 weeks' time. Thanks. See you later.